Okay, welcome to another Sabbath School summary. I'm Oswald, and we're going to dive right into this one. This is going to be over lesson 6, going over the roots of Abraham, and the memory verse is going to be taken from Hebrews 11 and verse 8. It says, "By faith Abraham obeyed when he was called out to the place which he would receive as an inheritance, and he went out not knowing where he was going." Now this is interesting. So this is going to be the story of Abraham now starting in Genesis chapter 12. Now this is something interesting to pay attention to. The Genesis is about 50 chapters long. It's not about, it's actually exactly 50 chapters long. And so if you look at the first 11 chapters, it goes over 2,000 years of Earth's history. Now Genesis 12 through 50 goes over 360 years or more of Earth's history. So what you find here is that Genesis 12 through 50 is basically 80% of the book of Genesis, but it actually goes over the least amount of years. And that shows you that there's something significant about the stories that take place between chapter 12 and chapter 50. So pay attention. The stories are going to slow down here. I'm going to be swatting a couple of gnats. Actually, I think these are mosquitoes trying to kill me. But either way, this should be a pretty good lesson. Now, here's the main thing. There's about 5 main stories that are going to happen here. The story of Abraham called to leave. It's going to be also Abraham's test about Egypt, going to Egypt. There's also going to be a split between Abraham and Lot. The other is going to be basically the First World War that took place. And then lastly, there's also Abraham and Melchizedek. You don't really have time to go deeply into all these stories, so you're probably going to have to pick a couple and just kind of start diving in on some of those. But we're going to kind of give you a brief summary of them, and there is something significant to pay attention to here. All right, so Abraham is leaving to go to the promised land that God is going to show him. He comes out of the land of Ur of the Chaldeans, which is actually Babylon. So in a sense, Abraham is being called out of Babylon to go to the land of Canaan. Now, this gets interesting because once Abraham arrives, he knows that this is the promised land, but the promised land has a famine. And so now he's wondering how he's going to take care of himself and his family. And so he decides to derail and go down to Egypt. Egypt is a heathenistic territory. He has a very beautiful wife, and so he tells his wife to act like she's going to be his sister, so the Egyptians don't get jealous and try to kill him to take his wife. And God works through that to basically bring about good. But what you're going to find here about these stories is Abraham is basically being tested at different parts of his life. So the big kind of question or the big thing that you don't want to miss here is this. What do you do when what God gives you does not satisfy your need? What do you do when what God gives you doesn't satisfy your need? Abraham was given the promised land. He gets to the promised land, and what he's supposed to receive does not satisfy his need. So now what does Abraham do? He's finding a way to come up with resolutions to his own problem. And that's the test that Abraham is going to go through basically from now until the end of his life. But pay attention to that. That's the first main point you want to see as you go through these stories. So if you move on now to Abraham and Lot, this is where it gets kind of interesting. So Abraham and Lot are moving along on their journey. And what happens here is that Abraham and Lot's, not Abraham and Lot personally, but their people, their brothers, their relatives, the people that are with them, their servants, they start to fight, right? And they're bickering back and forth. They can't come up with resolutions to their problems, and they keep on fighting. And Abraham decides, hey, maybe it's time for us to split. He tells Lot, hey, I'll go in whatever direction, the opposite direction that you go in. You can choose what land you want to go in. So Lot looks over the lands, and he sees one side, and you notice how I kind of tried to swat a mosquito there. Either way, so he sees one side there, and it's pretty much barren land. And he goes over, and he's like, no, I don't want this barren land. He looks over to the other side, and it's the side of Sodom and Gomorrah and a lot of heathenistic territories, but the land looks amazing. And so he's like, yes, let me take this land. And so Abraham and Lot split, but there's a problem here. Why does Lot inevitably leave Abraham, who has the promise? Remember back when Abraham's journey started and he got to the promised land? The unique test that happened is that the promised land had a famine, right? So think about this. Lot was with Abraham when the famine was happening. And so he sees that, wait a minute, Abraham's following God. There's definitely a promise here, but we're being brought through situations that don't satisfy our need. The last thing Lot wants to go through is going to a land that does not satisfy his needs. So he looks over to the nice land that's very good and it looks like everything's going to be fine, and he selects that land. Why? Because the last trial that he just came out of with Abraham was a situation in which the land did not provide for him. So this is something that's very interesting to pay attention to. So here's something to think about. Sometimes we make decisions against the will of God because we don't want to be put in a situation in which our needs are not met. So sometimes we make decisions against the will of God because we don't want to be put in a situation in which our needs are not met. Lot's need was not met in Canaan. He remembers that trial, and he doesn't want to have to go through that trial again. That's why he chooses that land close to Sodom and Gomorrah, the heathenistic land. He didn't care about the religion or the people. He just didn't want to experience the struggle that he just went through, even though God was with him. And sometimes we don't want to struggle at times, and we end up choosing something against the will of God simply because we don't want to have to go through a struggle in which our need is not being met. One thing to kind of wrap this summary up is that you have the world war and also Melchizedek. So what happens is, just to briefly summarize, we're not going to get too deeply into this, but in short, about 5 kings come together and they start making war with each other. It's likely due to some sort of rebellion with Babylon. It just depends on, like the scholars are kind of debating back and forth over what exactly the underlying issue was. But the point is, they likely were debating over the land that they were in, the territory. And so there was a fight that broke out, right? And so Lot and his people were taken, and Abraham gets some soldiers together and they go rescue Lot and take back the goods and bring it back. And Melchizedek, who's a priest, ends up meeting Abraham after that and blesses him because of that. And Abraham gave the goods back over to the kings that actually it was taken from. So it's kind of a significant story there, but just mainly get this in your head. The land that they were fighting over, in short, was the land that was actually promised to Abraham. So Abraham is seeing that people are fighting over a land that's essentially going to be later given to him and his descendants. But Abraham doesn't go out and try to fight for the land. He ends up only fighting just to get Lot back, showing that he's just trusting in God to bring about the plan whenever God is actually ready for it. And so that's the main thing to kind of wrap up there to get the lesson. Here's a profound meditation for you. Now, you remember that when Abraham went out to the land of Canaan, and the land of Canaan had a massive famine, right? So what ends up happening here is that the land of Canaan has this famine, and Canaan, although it's the promised land, it doesn't actually satisfy. But what it does have is it has potential. And that's the thing. Sometimes God promises us things, but when we actually arrive at this promise or we receive it, it's not what we expect, but it has potential to grow and develop into everything that we essentially need. So Abraham was given a land that wasn't fully developed yet, and so it didn't satisfy his need. And just something to think about as we kind of wrap up this lesson is simply this. One of the hardest things for us to be in is a place that has potential but does not immediately satisfy our problems. The hardest thing for us to do is to be in a place that has potential, but it doesn't immediately satisfy our problems. Now, you might be grateful that something has potential, but you really just want it to immediately satisfy your problem. And I want the same thing. But that's something to think about. Is there a situation in your life right now that you're not satisfied about, but perhaps it seems like maybe God has given it? Maybe it's a spouse or something. God has given you something, and it's not fully satisfying you. The person's not satisfying you. Maybe it's a situation that doesn't satisfy you. But the point is, you're not satisfied, but it has potential. God works through things that has potential, but sometimes it's hard for us to stick around long enough to see that to fruition. So that's the wrap up of the Sabbath School lesson. I hope you guys got the summary and the main point. Good luck on the lesson. It's a really good lesson, and hope to talk to you again. I'm Oswald. This is Profound Meditations, Sabbath School Summary.